Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, South by Southwest panel, going inside the next evolution of music creation and experience. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Tim Pride, Director of Music, Dolby.
Hi all, thank you again for joining us. Again, my name is Tim Pride, Director of Dolby Music, and again, welcome to our panel. Originally, we hoped to have been doing this all together in Austin, but circumstances being the way they are, we're doing this virtually, and hopefully you'll find it enjoyable and still one that is interactive. So we're excited to be bringing this group of artists and creatives together and hoping that you learn more about what they are doing when it comes to producing music in new immersive technologies such as Dolby Atmos. So we've got some great questions we're going to be going through. We're going to hear more from the panelists. We'll take questions from you and should be fun. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists now to introduce themselves. I'll start with LP. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I wish I could see your faces, but I'm sure you're smiling. My name is LP Giobbi, and I am a producer, DJ, keyboardist, synth player, and I'm also W Hotel's North American music director. And I started a nonprofit called FEMME that teaches women how to produce music, based in LA and now online as well. And then I also started a publishing company / touring party with Sophie Tucker, the dance duo, called Animal Talk. And we go into clubs and transform the space into neon jungles and rave. And also it's a venture with a joint venture with Third Side Music Publishing. So, you know, we can help grow the artists on and off the stage. And yeah, and when I tour, last year I toured with Galantis and Madion and Sophie Tucker, and had a lot of great touring memories. My live show is I have 3 CDJs and then a TR-8S and a TB3 and a keyboard. And those are all running through the 4th mixer on the DJM 900. And I had the honor of playing at Smart Bar in Chicago last year. Sound Bar, I do this every time. I love Smart Bar. Sound Bar in Chicago.
They are right next to each other, so it's understandable. They're right across the street, yeah.
And actually it was the Animal Talk party that went there, and I got to remix most of my tracks in Dolby Atmos, and you know, use an Atmos rig, DJ setup, and a stereo one, and got to interweave the two of them. And at one point I was even out on the dance floor with a rolly block controlling where the sound was coming from on one of my tracks. And that was like, I was just like crying and screaming, and I didn't really explain what was happening, but people could feel it, you know.
Nice.
And it was a really one of the highlights of my nerdy career. So
awesome.
Yeah, that's me.
Great. How about Samuel? Kick it over to you.
Okay, I am Samuel Lindley. My professional moniker is the legendary Traxster. I am a music producer from Chicago, started in the mid-90s. Well, my career started in the mid-90s. I started music when I was a kid. But I got my break in the mid-90s, working with some of the local acts in Chicago. Got my first hit record. I've had a very eventful career since then as a music producer, producing for various acts. I usually don't mention names, but I will for you guys. I produced My Chick Bad by Ludacris and Nicki Minaj. I produced on Mariah Carey's massive Nation of Me album. And I produced the Twisters' seminal album, Adrenaline Rush, in its entirety. So I also am the owner of Nothing But Dope LLC, which is an indie label based out of Los Angeles. And I now fill a role at Universal Music Group as the SVP of Indie Distribution Strategy. I'm also a member of the audio leadership team and involved in many of our initiatives, such as podcasting, live streaming, and my role in the audio leadership team has allowed me to work closely with Dope on the Atmos initiative. So from a creative standpoint and as a producer, of course, that is a dream come true for many of the aspirations that I've had as a music producer and creating sound and pushing the limits of technology. So through my role at UMG, I was able to take on a greater role in our company's partnership with Dolby and developing Atmos. But as a music producer, you know, I just enjoy creating in a format that I've dreamed about since the 90s. So I think that's the general overview of who I am. I may be leaving out some details. I'm also one half of the group House Lindley, a group that was formed last year with me and my wife. So shout out to my wife. Hope she's watching. And that's I covered a lot of ground really quickly.
All right, thanks, Samuel. And Karma, we'll pass it over to you.
Cool, thanks, Tim. First off, I just want to say I'm super excited to be on this panel with both LP and Samuel. They're both super accomplished in their music careers, on the production end, on the music side, and it's really cool to get to hang out with some cool creatives who work on the technical side of music too. Also, just want to thank Tim, Ben, Stephanie, Carrie, everybody over at Dolby for putting this together, and South by Southwest, of course, for putting this together. Super fun. Hi, everyone. My name is Karma Auger, and I basically grew up in a very musical household. My father's name is Brian Auger. He's a Hammond organ player. I was born in London, and I moved to the States when I was about 5 years old in 1975. When I was 2 years old, I started threading my dad's 1/4-inch reel-to-reel machine, plugging in my headphones and putting them on and listening to his masters when he would come home from the studio with the 1/4-inch masters to check out at home on the home stereo. And basically, ever since I can remember, I've been surrounded by music. I've heard music being played live in the house, and then, of course, recorded music. And for some reason, I was always fascinated with the technical things. How do you do this, and how do you plug that, and how do you make that work? So fast forward to I'm like 18 years old, and I kind of started at the bottom of the music industry. Not the bottom, but at the beginning, let's say. I started out as a roadie. I started traveling all over the world as a road crew person and taking care of gear on the technical side of things. I ended up going to engineering school and studied music engineering for a while, and then parlayed that into both doing sound and live recording, studio recording, all those things. I'm also a drummer. I've been a touring drummer for the last 30 years. I've worked in different groups, but I've worked most exclusively with my father's band, and we've basically been on every continent in the world over the last 20 years, and it's been an incredible, inspirational experience. Also, to work with my father has been a great pleasure and a great honor. My most recent endeavor into the music world, and my newest, biggest, most favorite thing to do, is to mix here in my studio, which is Studio One LA. We're based in Venice in Los Angeles. I'm the owner and chief engineer here with my partner Eric Goebel, and we've just absolutely fallen in love with Atmos. It is by far the coolest thing to happen in a while, and I'm lucky enough that I've got to work both on the music side of this a lot and also on the post-production side, and tell you more about those things coming up shortly. But that's basically who I am, and I'm super happy to be here and join all of you.
Great. Thanks, Karma. Samuel, LP, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to take the next 20 minutes and introduce myself. I've got an extensive career, and no, I'm not going to do all that, as it would pale in comparison to your musical backgrounds. But again, we thank you for being on the panel. And for those of you who are joining us again, many of you may know Dolby's history, and some of you may not. But Dolby is really a company that's really started in music, and Ray Dolby founded the company over 55 years ago with an eye towards the creative. And for those who don't know, Ray was a very avid fan of music, specifically jazz and classical, and he would sit and work with artists, creatives, and engineers and try to figure out what it is that he could do to help bring their vision to life. And one of the first things Ray did was work with artists to unlock the ability for them to record multi-track. Back in the 60s, a lot of times what would be happening in a recording studio is there'd be a lot of tape hiss. And so tape noise, tape hiss was something that really didn't lend itself well when you were trying to track multiple recordings on top of each other. And so Ray, with a bunch of very intelligent and great engineers, created Dolby's noise reduction technology. A lot of people are familiar with Dolby because of that. But the reason why I share that with you is that heritage and that culture of working with artists and creatives has maintained. Dolby really does start with the experience first, and we really do want to understand what the creatives are thinking and what we can do to help them. And so that's why today we're talking about Dolby Atmos, because it was a experience we worked on with creatives, such as the people on the panel. So that's the quick background on Dolby and why we're here talking about what we're talking about. That said, as I mentioned earlier, we all were supposed to be in Austin together in person, but now we are all confined, sheltered in place, working out of our homes. For the panel, how has that been as far as keeping the creative juices going? What have you learned from having to really be confined to either your home studio or having to create a home studio? Really curious how this has impacted your creative. Start with LP. We'll just start with you.
Yeah, great question. Well, so it's been, you know, there's a lot of pluses and maybe a few minuses, but for me, I was touring probably about 9 to 10 months out of the year the last few years. Yeah. So constantly on the road, and that's sort of why I added some live gear into my DJ set, so that I could figure out a way to like keep creating. Like I would literally be on a train on my way to Vienna, and like I had my TR-8S out, and I'm like using that as an interface to like record in other things and try to like keep making music. You know, I had to figure out a way to do that while touring, because I was touring so much. So now that I'm home and I have all my synths and the, you know, space and time, that's for sure been a positive. And I've also started live streaming, which is something I never thought I would do, but here we are. And yep. That's sort of, I'm doing a lot of different kinds of sets, and obviously there's no like dance floor in front of me, so I'm sort of becoming a little bit more experimental in what I'm playing, which is for sure rubbing off on the music that I'm creating right now. And also still collaborating, figuring out ways to collaborate, you know, using Zoom sessions or just sending things back and forth, which has sort of given me actually more time and space to, you know, really go off of somebody's idea on my own, which has been a gift. Yeah, so, you know, I definitely I was really inspired by seeing things on the road and like looking out the window and like I love to ride on an airplane, even though the bass was horrible. But I like to get ideas out that way. Like, you know, you're just in the air and there's no emails, distractions, or, so I definitely am missing that and trying to find inspiration in other places, mostly walking around my neighborhood. So, you know, I think there's a lot of pluses and a few challenges.
And how about you, Karma? How have you adapted to the latest in how we're all in home?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we're all stuck here at home, and I'm lucky my studio is very close by, so, and it's environment that is clean, so I can come here and I can still work. So one of the things that my partner Eric and I have been doing to kind of keep each other and everybody, all our families and everybody safe, is we've been remote working. So here I'm in the studio and I have a full Atmos setup. My setup is a 7.1.4. So we have, and for those who have heard maybe what Atmos is, but aren't necessarily sure. So basically what used to be called surround is now called immersive. So it's an immersive setup. I'm sure everyone's heard of 5.1 and 7.1. And now that's parlayed into this new format called Dolby Atmos, which for me is truly immersive. It's super exciting. So I have 7 speakers in the room, like a 7.1 setup. My 1 is my sub, and then 0.4, which is my ceiling speakers, 2 in front of me and 2 behind me. And what that gives you, those ceiling speakers, is the big difference. It gives you a true 3-dimensional space in which you can move sound around in. You mix in beds and in objects. That's the difference between mixing in stereo than in mixing in Atmos. So the beds are basically your speaker output. So because I have 12 speakers, I have 12 beds. So each one of my speakers is a bed. And then your objects are almost like a tennis ball that you place into a 3D space. So you can take that sound, let's say the bass, and you can put it up in the room like this, and you can put it right in front of your head, and you can put it behind your head, and you can fly it around inside the room, and you can make that object bigger, and you can make that object smaller. And so you can do that with every kind of sound. So try to imagine mixing in a space where, let's say, for example, you want to feel like you're in the band, sitting on the bandstand. So you could put the drums in front of you, the vocal in the center, the bass directly behind you, one guitar to the left, one guitar to the right, the keyboards somewhere else, and you could feel like you're in a space. There's a million different ways to do it. So a lot of what I do is mixing other people's projects. And the way that I've been able to continue doing that is working remotely. I'm working on a very cool project right now called DBM, Dead by Midnight. It's a post-production project that we're basically, it's a graphic comic by a couple of really, really cool creative guys. Gareth Thomas and Byron Carr are Dead by Midnight, and they're a band, but they have this graphic comic series that they're putting out. And so we're building all the atmosphere, all the sound effects. They'll record all the vocal stuff, and then they'll send us all those stems, and we'll assemble everything here. And the way that we're doing it is Eric, my partner, will work on his laptop at home, and we have a Dropbox, and we'll both get on a FaceTime call or something like that. So we're both kind of hanging out and talking, and then he'll work on atmospheric things and sound effects for a piece that we need. And then he's working in headphones in binaural mode, but it doesn't quite translate exactly the same as an actual Atmos setup. So what he'll do is then he'll drop them in the Dropbox to me. I'll grab them, pull them into the session, and then we'll talk about how we want that to feel, how we want that to look, and then I'll fly them around, do everything here, and then I'll pop that Pro Tools session with all the new changes back into the Dropbox. He'll open it, have a listen, and then we move forward from there. Of course, always renaming and renumbering sessions so that you don't get confused of what's going on as you go.
Oh, good old versions, yep.
So that's one of the ways that we've been moving forward. Another is just finishing up a couple records in Atmos and folding down to stereo. That's the other great thing about Atmos is you can fold out to all formats. So from Atmos, you can go to 7.1, 5.1, or stereo. And really cool things happen in stereo when you've mixed it in Atmos, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. But so I've been just finalizing things where, any kind of remote work where people say, oh, could you make this tweak, or could you fix this, or help me with that? Then those things are actually really easy at this time.
Well, that's encouraging to see that you've been able to maintain that, the creative essence of what you're working on, even if you are having to do it remotely. And thank you for the great overview of what Atmos is. You obviously have had some good experience working with it. Samuel, I'll ask you, kind of give us a, I think it'd be good to hear, like, how were you first introduced to Dolby Atmos in this immersive format? And if you want to expand a bit more on what Carmen was saying about how you've maintained staying creative, working from home with it, that would be great too.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with how I maintain, or how this has impacted me creatively. I think the most important thing is that it's given me some time back, right? Because you know, I usually am in between all the UMG buildings in LA, and you know, LA commutes, right? It takes a lot of time. So that
no idea what you're talking about. It's no idea. It's really easy to get around LA for those who aren't familiar.
But getting my time back has allowed me to have a couple of extra hours to create. The first thing I realized when I got those hours back was how many updates I was behind on a lot of things, including my Atmos rig at home. So that has been very helpful for me to get some time back and update software and do all of those things, and then being able to be creative. So it's been, you know, it's been a positive thing for me creatively, just to have more time in my day to eventually get to creating, right? In regards to Atmos, my introduction to Atmos occurred around the time that I started at UMG a few years ago. And I was actually introduced, you know, on a really big stage. So there's a Dolby facility in Hollywood, the Dolby Vine Theater, right? And Michael Fry, the gentleman who recruited me, invited me to a exhibition of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper realization in Atmos.
For the 50th anniversary.
For the 50th anniversary, exactly. Yeah. So I go in this room, in this theater, all the lights are turned off, and we listen to the whole album in Atmos. And originally that album was a mono album, right? So now it's broken out into Atmos. I'm hearing things fly around the room, spinning around in this thing, and I don't think I really understood. I knew that it was a new platform, and I knew what I was hearing, but I don't think I really understood the impact it could have. But as I came in and started working with the Capitol Studios, working at Capitol Studios, I did some mixes in Atmos. Having that Beatles experience as a reference, and then the producer gears started turning. And I was thinking, wow, there's so much I can do in regards to storytelling with this platform, right? In regards to narratives within the music. Being able to articulate experiences that I couldn't articulate before. For example, you know, if you hear something behind you, it causes a reaction to turn around.
Right.
And being able to manipulate the production of a record in a way that allow for connection with other human senses is where I started really understanding the power of immersive mixing and how it was going to change how I approach music. So from the Sgt. Pepper 50th anniversary event to starting to mix in Atmos, you know, that was my introduction to it. But my actual introduction as a producer was once I had that experience, got in Capitol and mixed one of my own songs. And then I've been quite the advocate ever since.
You mentioned the impact that it had on you, and then as you started having more experience in working with it, I would love to hear from each of you, how has that impact or the understanding of being able to take audio and now have it placed in a room, how has that changed the way you either A, create, produce music, or B, think about how your fans may be hearing music, right? Because oftentimes as creatives, we're thinking you're doing something for yourself and you want to express your art, but then you oftentimes may think, well, how are my fans, how are the people I'm going to be putting this in front of going to hear it? LP, you had experience working in Atmos. What was some of the things that you learned as you started to get more familiar with it, the tools, et cetera? But from a creative standpoint, what did it do for you?
Yeah, great question. So my first experience, I was actually in San Francisco. I had a show. I don't know, this was maybe like about a year or two ago. And like when I first got into electronic music, I was all in on like the gear and, you know, getting my hands on as many different oscillators and synths as I could, and I was really into that part of it. I was brought down here to work with the Daft Punk camp, and the first synths I touched were from their pyramid tour, which was crazy. So I was really into that, and I kind of then just like fell into DJing, which then led me back to producing though, luckily. And I had a phone call with my manager about how I wanted to I really cared about learning more about the technology side of things and pushing things forward and pushing the bounds. And she set up a meeting with me at Dolby. And I remember I was like kind of stressed out. It was a big show for me, and I was like kind of stressed out and nervous, and like I was just feeling like I was about to cancel the meeting. And I called my dad and I told him, I'm like, I'm feeling stressed. I think I'm just gonna I have this meeting. And he's like, well, what's the meeting? I was like, oh, it's with Dolby. They had like some new technology. And he was like, Leah, I remember the first time that I heard Pink Floyd play. Their setup was quad. They had like, you know, speakers in 4 different areas. So that he's like, and that he's like, maybe I was on acid, but that changed my life. He's like, if they're like, this is the stuff, like this is what you care about. So
Yeah.
I found the time and I went and I sat in this, you know, in this theater with the Atmos and listened to, I think mine was the Elton John track.
Rocket Man.
Yes, and I had heard things in that song that I had never heard before, and
Amazing.
started weeping.
Really?
Yes, it was Aaron, and Aaron was there, and I was just like so overwhelmed by this feeling and these things I'd never heard before. And my first thought was, whenever I send a track off for notes to a label or to, you know, different creator friends, the note I always get back, always, is you have too many things in this. Like there's too many things coming in this track, and so they're not going to hit as hard because there's just, you know, you just can't. There's one speaker, it's all coming out of there. You have to take like literally every time. And so when I was sitting there crying, I remember thinking, there's space. Like
Yes.
I can put anything in here, you know, everything is spread out. And so I'm hearing all these different things that, and most of my tracks are just, they're not coming out. And so I felt so much excitement for getting to like put in all those sounds that I cultivated, I cared so much about, and like I believed in, like they're now going to finally have their little areas to come out. So that to me felt like I get to kind of step more into like my authentic creativity,
Awesome.
and where it sort of felt a little bit stifled before. So that's how it was so impactful to me.
I think what you just said there is something we do hear a lot about around the sense of space, and that term can be used in a few different ways. It can be either with Atmos, it's really, Atmos allows people to create a sense of space. A lot of you as producers, engineers have spent countless hours trying to produce a song to have it have a certain vibe. You know, whether it's about, well, let's make the whole thing sound like we're in a jazz club, or let's make the whole thing sound like we're in a big arena. So that's one interpretation of what space can mean. I think what you were alluding to a little bit, LP, is that idea that you have all these great ideas, some different melodies with different instruments, but then when you cram it all together, and as we all know, as you start mixing it down, you start to lose, whether it's frequencies fighting with each other or you're trying to pump the level on certain things. And Atmos lends itself to really giving you that more space for those instruments to live. Is that more like what you were referring to? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I felt like yeah, there's finally just like when I heard the new sounds I never heard in Rocket Man, like the new even like piano melody lines I could not hear, like we're not coming through with all the other stuff. All of a sudden there it was so clear because it had its own little pocket right here, you know, which was also very intentional. Like it wasn't center, but it was right there. So that was just so, it was such a beautiful moment for me. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, that the fact that you shared that with us, I think just reinforces again the importance of music in general, of a way for us to be connecting emotionally with ourselves and others. But then for something like a technology like this to unlock that even more, I think is really powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Karma, you had made, oh, well, yeah, it's all me. You're welcome. It's been, I mean, Atmos has been around for 10 years now, really, as far as the company coming up with the idea and really trying to think about how they can empower creatives. And it's really just recently when it started getting into the hands of musicians and artists that are starting to unlock it. And we continue to refine it by working with folks like yourselves and you telling us what you like, what would work better. Karma, you had mentioned earlier about how you were placing instruments in a room. As you've gotten more familiar also with the tools and some of the projects you're working on, what's one of the learnings you've gathered from the process of just, you know, spending time with it that you'd like to share? Meaning, like, are you finding yourself when you sit down to a mix that you automatically start placing instruments in certain areas, or do you let the song speak to you and then you just let Atmos kind of do its thing? You know, how are you approaching, because many of us have spent 10, 20, 30, 40 years working in stereo. This is a whole new experience, a whole new learning curve. So would love to get some insight into kind of how what you've learned from it.
Sure. So first thing I want to mention is, and this goes along with part of our process, is I want to just build on what LP was just talking about. So in stereo mixing, basically you have width and you have height, and this is how you try to build your mix. But most importantly is depth of field. Yeah. And that depth of field, especially today where we're compressing everything to the end of time to try to get every millisecond of dB out of everything to get that mix to speak and all that, can sometimes get squashed. And then we lose that space that we have, that feeling of 3D. That is automatically built into Atmos. It is part of it just comes with the territory. I really don't know any other way to say it. There's depth of field for days, and then it's just a question of how you explore it and how you use it, how you operate within it. Our kind of creative process in terms of mixing. So really lucky to get to work in music, in post-production, and get to be creative in all those processes. So our Eric and Mai's thing is we're a mixed team, and we approach everything from a standpoint of serving the song, serving the story, serving whatever it is that we're doing. So for example, first I'll just talk a little bit on the technical side. One of the coolest creative things has been to reinvent the toolbox. So a lot of stereo guys, let's say most stereo people, right? You have a chain that you mix through. You have your stereo bus that you go through, and you put this on it, you put that on it, and you love this compressor, and you like this limiter, and you do all these things, and that becomes your sound, right?
I'm sorry, let me just interrupt you for 1 second. We're sectioning off stereo guys from us being Atmos people. that's our approach now. Okay, I just wanted to know. You said stereo guys.
Well, what I mean is in stereo, which we all have been, and we still are, I still mix in stereo. I have a channel or a bus that I mix through, and it's kind of like it helps you achieve your sound, right? Like we all have tools that we go to which help us get to the place we're trying to get to the quickest way. Sometimes people reinvent every time, but a lot of times I rely on stereo bus, and I kind of have a system through which I mix, which helps me get to where I'm going the quickest way. And a lot of guys who I love have a sound, you know, mixers that you love who mix this record or that record. They get called because they have a particular style of mixing or they have a sound, which we all love. Coming to Atmos is very kind of freeing because there isn't that stereo bus. So then you have to create a new palette of sound, and that's been one of the most exciting things, is creating the new palette of sound. And what does that look like? So creating reverbs, creating effects, and there's different ways to do it. You could have a reverb that's a mono reverb that comes up everywhere when your sound is in the room. You could create a zone reverb that has a 3D panner, and you can move that reverb or that effect around in the room. Movement is really, really cool in Atmos. Sometimes you want the actual object or the sound to move, but sometimes you, in order to create space, you'll keep that object where it is, and maybe you'll just move the effect a little bit around in the room or change the space with that. So that's been a really effective tool. So tools like that are really useful, and that's been one of the greatest pleasures of working in Atmos, is kind of developing these new tools. That's been really fun.
Yeah, that you just mentioned about a specific technique you said there, Karma, like you'd have an instrument sitting one place, but then maybe the effect of the instrument moving around you. Samuel, I think you've done some things like that too, right? Where you actually have the effects moving, but say the instrument is staying. Is that correct? Have you done some techniques like that?
I have, but one of the biggest developments for me lately was I actually created some music in Atmos. So what I mean
in Atmos.
Starting in Atmos.
Okay.
I actually connected my MPC X at Capitol to the Atmos system and was composing with these speakers around me. And the way that I did it was I used the outputs to be certain positions in space, and then use the pans to move those between the pans and the outputs to pan the sounds around the room. And when I started, you know, when you're composing, it's the art now. It's not the technical side. So when I started panning and moving things around the room in real time, that was a brand new experience for me, right? In music, I hadn't actually felt that feeling since I was a kid, because we had been stereo guys, as my colleague so eloquently put it, for so long that hearing music in a new format being created and creating in that format was actually a completely new experience, which is something that we don't get very often now. New experiences, right? So, so speaking to the question about moving effects opposed to moving the actual objects, in that environment, it's about moving everything. The effects, the objects doing, you know, it's a couple of DJ effects in the MP that were mind-blowing hearing in Atmos. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of new territory to experiment in.
That's great.
Samuel, can I ask you a question about that? Because I find that like one of the coolest things. Did you find when you were mixing that maybe something that you thought was going to work didn't quite work the way you thought it was going to work, and maybe something that you didn't think was going to work was like turned into a happy accident and was really creative and super effective?
I mean, you know, in some cases, even contemplating what's going to work was not, I can't even do it because it's such a new, you know, format. But I do find, you know, one of the things that I have been doing in my relationship with Dolby has been pushing the limits of what are already accepted practices. So I often find in that, you know, and I have to be very careful what I say and don't say, but in that workflow, I try a lot of things that don't work for my creative intent, not necessarily technically, right? But for what I'm the creative intent that I'm trying to convey. And then sometimes I discover things that I say that's the way to do that, right? So every day is pretty much every day that I'm mixing Atmos is pretty much a adventure, creative adventure. You know?
Well, that's fantastic. Great question, Karma. There's I think what the spirit of what you're all talking about is really just scratching the surface of this new creative environment. And there is a lot of questions as I'm watching these questions come in around more of the creative. So at this point, I think I'd like to turn it over to some of the questions coming in from our audience. And one of the questions I can just do a quick answer, because there's a few on this, is around what DAWs or digital audio workstations are supporting Dolby Atmos. And just for everyone out there, Dolby Atmos is natively supported in Nuendo and Pro Tools, and we recently now have plugins for Ableton and Logic. So a lot of the main digital audio workstations that people are both producing and post-producing music in have support for Dolby Atmos. And there's ways that you can gain access to the additional tools needed for Atmos through our website, as well as other websites from those DAWs. We have a question in here, let's see, around mastering. This is always a good one. How do you handle mastering an object-based music production? Is it a step during the mixing process? Do you send your mix songs to an immersive mastering engineer, etc.? This is a great question because this is also something that is one that Dolby's continuing to work on. But I think I'll turn it over to the panel. When you've been doing your mixes, how are you thinking about mastering, or how are you mastering your final projects? I'll start with Samuel. I think maybe you've done some of this already.
I have. So mastering is a bit of a difficult subject to address because the reason that we implemented mastering as an art form, let's call it, is because of the limitations of stereo in regards to dynamic range in comparison to other records, right? I.e. the loudness wars, right? Atmos is not necessarily subject to that constraint. We are currently writing the
playbook.
The playbook for Atmos, exactly. So in regards to mastering, it's almost in some senses counterintuitive to the format, because you have so much space that you can highlight and create this dynamic piece of art, that mastering is almost like counterintuitive, but it is a part of what we're used to, and especially when we're translating records that are created in stereo to Atmos, right? So once there's a stereo version, there's a sense of artistic intent that was captured in the stereo version that we need to translate to Atmos. So there's been a lot of creative approaches to mastering in regards to, multiple dynamic range plugins handling the different components of the mix. How the tracking of the 2-track stems is done in order to preserve some of the dynamic limiting that was created in the mastering and the mixing process. There's been different approaches. So I guess the answer is we're still figuring that out. How to approach mastering in the way that maintains the same artistic intent that the artist, the original record, and even the mastering engineer that mastered the 2-track version intended, and how that's been impacting people for as long as people have been enjoying the record.
In regards to the a lot of the things that all of you have been sharing is the kind of the things you've been learning about it, learning about what works, new things that we're writing, the playbook that we're writing. Are there any do nots that you've learned? Like anything that you've learned that's like, you don't want to do this, or you found doesn't work, is a question from somebody. So LP, I'll hand over to you. Is there anything that you learned like you find is a do not?
Great question. I mean, I like to think there are no rules ever, period. So that's that. But I think for me, I create dance music. So something that I'm always going to put the kick in the middle. I'm always going to keep the kick like right straight ahead. And I'm not gonna like put it off in a corner or, you know, just like above me or what, because that's the most important part of dance music, in my opinion. And even like the snares and the hats, I think that they can have a little bit of movement, but I think that you want to keep them pretty to the core of the music and pretty all around all the time. But for me, I found that playing with the elements that like, and it's interesting to think about creating in Atmos because I've only created a song and then mixed it that way. And I'm sure that that was really inspiring, Samuel, because I feel like that would really change how, you know, I did a track and it starts with vocals and I mixed it later on with like the vocals kind of like coming over and back because like I wanted her to speak and then like leave essentially. And I feel like I maybe would have written different lyrics to that had I known that was going to happen. But I think that, you know, I think sky's the limit. And I also think it really depends on what genre of music you're making and, you know, who your listener is and what you imagine your listener to be doing. Are they dancing? Are they, you know, just having a moment? I think that really would inform how you're going to mix these.
Karma, how about you?
Cool. I like LP. I like your take on that. I think musically speaking, you always should be, and I think that's essentially what you're saying, which is you should serve the music, the project, whatever it is. And there's certain kind of rules within each thing that help you do that. I think it really depends on the project. I think the only rule that I follow is to make sure that we're honoring and serving the story and the music really. And other than that, I think it's kind of the sky is the limit. I'll give you an example. So I worked on just recently a record for a guy named Jimmy Haslip. He's bass player and founding member of a band called the Yellow Jackets. They've been around for a long time and fantastic guy. And he was working on this jazz fusion kind of world music project with musicians from all over the world. And there was a flute player from Borneo on this project who hand carves his own flutes out of wood that he finds in the jungle, and his playing is just incredible. And to create just the right kind of reverb and slight delays and things, and to time those and to get them all right so that they sit in all the speakers in different places, and then to slightly move that flute during solos, like even just a little bit of movement is really cool. It doesn't necessarily take your it's enough that it would take your it wouldn't make you aware that it's like flying around, but just a little bit of movement is really fun and cool. And then Jimmy was also producing another project, which was this bluegrass project called Big Tent of the Bison, which he brought here for us to mix, and we mixed a song in Atmos. And with a project with fiddle and upright bass and acoustic guitars and harmonies and vocals, we found with that project, we didn't really, if you moved anything around a bunch, it really took away from pulling you into the track. So so we left everything kind of static. It found its place, and then maybe we slightly moved some effects around and things like that, but kept movement to a minimum on that project. And so I think really the only rule is when you close your eyes and you hear it, does it speak to you, and does it touch you, and does it make you feel the way you want to feel when you hear it? Because ultimately that's really what that's the beauty of music, really, isn't it? Is that it has a special direct line into our soul that's different to a visual experience. And that's what I'm always looking for. How does this make me feel when I work on any project? If it doesn't make me feel the way I want to feel, it's not done. It has to. That's when I know I've finished a mix, when it takes me through the way I want to feel.
And Karma, is the mix really ever done? I mean, is it ever really done?
Tim,
you don't have
you bring up a good point, Tim. The mix is never done, but it has to be done, and so therefore you must stop.
Right, you must stop.
There must be a stopping point.
There's a few questions coming in related to the, as people are talking about studio setups and how you all are set up, whether it be at a Capitol Records level or a home studio setup, or doing things on the road. LP, you'd mentioned when as you're traveling and you're trying to come up with new ideas that are lending itself to, how do you think about Atmos as it relates to sitting in a studio with speakers as well as with headphones? As we all work in stereo, we use headphones and speakers to monitor and play back and forth and understand the relation. What has your experience been? And there's quite a few questions around this in the spirit of working with Atmos in both a headphone experience, given that people are consuming music with headphones, and working with speakers. Samuel, I'll let you start this one. Again, that's kind of the spirit of quite a few questions here asking about that.
Yeah, so I don't have a speaker set up at home. I use headphones primarily to do my experimentation in Atmos here. I started, as I said, at Capitol with my first Atmos mixes. So I had the opportunity to find my way in the headphone experience first, in creating Atmos mixes in the speaker experience first. Then when I got to headphones, it became all about, giving me the same experience that I felt in the speaker environment. And it's different. I actually now start all my mixes in headphones and then expand to the speaker environment to finish them. But once you understand both, you can imagine and kind of compensate for the other. So mixing in speakers, I think about the headphone experience, and obviously mixing in headphones, I think about the speaker experience. They're different experiences. They're not the same experience, and I think you have to contemplate both in the process.
And just so for the folks listening out there, just so you're familiar with what tools we have, the tools that Atmos allows for artists to use are the ability for you to optimize for both a speaker and a headphone experience. Our tools allow for you to make decisions in your headphone experience that don't necessarily impact the overall mix. So there's additional tools that we put in there. The point being, we want to be able to give artists the ability to actually optimize both a speaker and a headphone playback experience. And that's just so everybody's familiar with what the tools are.
And the headphone experience is completely different from a stereo mix, what it sounds like. And that's something that I spend a lot of time experimenting with, is how to make that experience even more compelling. It's in the binaural, which is the version of what the technology Atmos uses for the headphone experience. And sometimes I put on the headphones, and what I really want to feel is, that stimulation of those other senses, the directional information. And it's quite enjoyable. And to be honest, Atmos has changed how I mix in stereo, because working in Atmos makes me think so much about space and positioning that when I go back to stereo mixing, I'm thinking of the same thing.
Yeah, Karma's shaking his head. Yes, he's like, yeah, definitely. That's great.
What are your thoughts on that, Karma?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. So just so the listeners understand, there's a setting in the Dolby renderer software where you can set headphones to binaural mode, which is what Samuel was talking about. And in binaural mode, the software basically, we monitor here also in headphones and in speakers, and we go back and forth as we, as we mix, as we're checking stuff. And binaural's great. It's really useful and amazing. Some things don't translate exactly. So what I find with binaural is front to back doesn't necessarily translate quite the same, but across translates amazing, above translates amazing, and around translates amazing. LP was talking about having vocals fly over your head and go backwards earlier, right? Which is so fun and super effective. Or one thing I've done in one thing we did in one song was it was more like a pop tune, and we had before the break would kick in, I'd have the drum fill actually play out of the back speakers real loud and then kick into the front once the one hit. Just little tricks like that that are useful. And then in headphones, it kind of translates, but not quite the same as it does, obviously, if you have 12 speakers in a room. But yeah, there's so much creativity that can happen in headphones. I would definitely say to anybody out there who's interested in checking it out and getting just kind of like getting your feet wet, it's a very easy way to get into it. You don't need a whole giant stereo setup and speakers everywhere. I think anybody has access to this, and because it's software based, it's a piece of software. That's it. You can use any headphones in any now you can use Ableton, you can use Logic, you can Innuendo, you can use Pro Tools. So any DAW that you're using, jump in and check it out. And to Samuel's point also about mixing, once you've mixed in Atmos, and then you listen to stereo and you think about stereo differently, 100% agree with that, 1000% agree with that. One of the things that we do is we then fold down to stereo. So the album or the CD is going to come out in stereo, and then there's Atmos mixes for the record, which are going to go out streaming, and that's how Atmos is available right now. Unless, of course, you were printing Blu-rays or something, but no, anybody that's doing that right now, none of the people that we're working with are. And so when you fold down to stereo, the coolest stuff happens from an Atmos mix into stereo. Choices that you could never have come up with or thought of or dreamt up in stereo that happen in stereo from an Atmos mix. So I would say if you're interested in it, definitely jump in. Don't be afraid of it. Check it out. There's resources to help you get things all set up. And the only other thing I would say is your I/O, which is all your inputs and outputs and all your DAWs, become a ninja of the I/O. That's where the whole game plays out, in the I/O, making sure you get all your ins and outs set up properly and get your buses all set up properly for all of your effects and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you, Karma, for that. And I think that's the new tag, become a ninja for your I/O, Dolby Atmos. No, marketing team's gonna kill me. So with that, we're at time. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but as you can see on the screen, we do have resources for you. One of the questions was, how do people experience Dolby Atmos today? There are lots of titles that have been released on Blu-rays, but also it is available through streaming services such as Amazon Music HD and Tidal. There's some QR codes for you to scan right now. You can get some free 30-day trials to check that out. If you have more questions, go to music.dolby.com, or you can also email musicstudios@dolby.com. With that, I sincerely want to thank the panelists, Karma, LP, Samuel. It's been super fun. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in Austin. Maybe next year we'll do this, and we're all looking forward to more of the music you're going to be producing in Dolby Atmos. Thanks to South by Southwest for continuing to make this happen this year, and we appreciate everybody joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.